The Last Lecture by Randy Pausch. I have an engineering problem. Well, for the most part, I'm in terrific physical shape. I have 10 tumors in my liver, and I have only a few months left to live. I am a father of 3 young children and married to a woman of my dreams. While I could easily feel sorry for myself, that wouldn't do them or me any good. So, how to spend my very limited time? The obvious part is being with and taking care of my family while I still can. I embrace every moment with them and do the logistical things necessary to ease their path into a life without me. The less obvious part is how to reach and teach my children what I would have taught them over the next 20 years. They're too young now to have any of these conversations. All parents want to teach their children right from wrong, what we think is important, and how to deal with challenges life will bring. We also want them to know some stories from our own lives, often as a way to teach them how to lead their own life. My desire to do that led me to give the last lecture at Carnegie Mellon University. These lectures are routinely videotaped. I knew that what I was doing that day. Under the ruse of giving an academic lecture, I was trying to put myself in a bottle that would one day wash up on the beach for my children. If I were a painter, I would have painted for them. If I were a musician, I would have composed music. But I am a lecturer, so I lectured. I lectured about the joy of life, about how much I appreciate life, even with so little of my own left. I talked about honesty, integrity, gratitude, and other things I hold dear. And I tried very hard not to be boring. This book is a way for me to continue what I began on the stage, because time is precious and I want to spend all that I have and can with my kids. I asked Jeffrey Zaslow for help. Each day I ride my bike around the neighborhood, getting exercise crucial for my health. On 53 long mile rides, I spoke to Jeff on my cell phone headset. He then spent countless hours helping me turn my stories, I suppose we could call them 53 lectures, into the book that follows. We knew right from the start none of this replacement for a living parent. But engineering isn't about perfect solutions. It's about doing the best you can with limited resources. Both the lecture and this book are my attempts to do exactly that. The Last Lecture. Chapter 1. An injured lion still wants to roar. A lot of professors give talks titled The Last Lecture. Maybe you've seen one. It has become a common exercise on college campuses. Professors are asked to consider their demise and to ruminate on what matters most to them. And while they speak, audiences can't help but mull the same question. What wisdom would we impart to the world if we knew it was our last chance? If we had to vanish tomorrow, what would we want as our legacy? For years, Carnegie Mellon had a last lecture series, but by the time the organizers got around to asking me to do it, they had renamed their series Journeys, asking selected professors to offer reflections on their personal and professional journeys. It was not the most exciting description, but I agreed to go with it and was given a September slot. At the time, I already had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, but I was optimistic. Maybe I'd be among the lucky ones who survive. Whilst I went through treatment, those running the lecture series kept sending me emails. What will you be talking about? They asked. Please provide an abstract. There's a formality in academia that can't be ignored, even if a man is busy with other things like trying not to die. By mid-August, I was told that a poster of the lecture had to be printed, so I'd have to decide on a topic. That very week, however, I got the news. My most recent treatment hadn't worked. I had just months to live. I knew I could cancel the lecture. Everyone would understand. Suddenly, there were so many other things to be done. I had to deal with my own grief and the sadness of those who loved me. I had to throw myself into getting my family's affairs in order, and yet, despite everything, I couldn't shake the idea of giving the talk. I was energized by the idea of delivering a last lecture that really was a last lecture. What could I say? How would it be received? Could I even get through it? They'll let me back out, I told my wife, Jay, but I really want to do it. Jay has always been my cheerleader. When I was enthusiastic, so was she. But she was leery of this whole last lecture idea. We had just moved from Pittsburgh to southeastern Virginia, so after my death, Jay and the kids could be near to her family. Jay felt I ought to be spending my precious time with our kids or unpacking our new house rather than devoting my hours to writing the lecture and then traveling back to Pittsburgh to deliver it. Call me selfish, Jay told me, but I want all of you. Any time you spend working on this lecture is lost time because it's time away from the kids and from me. I understood where she was coming from. From the time I'd gotten sick, I'd made a pledge to myself to defer to Jay and honor her wishes. I saw it as my mission to do all I could to lessen the burdens in her life brought on by my illness. That's why I spent many of my waking hours making arrangements for my family's future without me. Still, I couldn't let go of my urge to give this last lecture. Throughout my academic career, I'd given some pretty good talks, but being considered the best speaker in a computer science department is being known as the tallest of the seven dwarfs. And right then, I had the feeling that I had more in me, that if I gave it my all, I might be able to offer people something special. Wisdom is a strong word, but maybe that was it. Jay still wasn't happy about it. We eventually took the issue to Michelle Reese, a psychotherapist we'd begun seeing a few months earlier. She specializes in helping families when one member is confronting a terminal illness. I know Randy, Jay told Dr. Reese. He's a workaholic. I know just what he'll be like when he starts putting the lecture together. It'll be all-consuming. The lecture, she argued, would be an unnecessary diversion from the overwhelming issues we were grappling with in our lives. Another matter upsetting Jay. To give the talk as scheduled, I would have to fly to Pittsburgh the day before the lecture, which was Jay's 41st birthday. This is my last birthday we'll celebrate together, she told me. You're actually going to leave me on my birthday? Certainly, the thought of leaving Jay that day was painful to me, and yet I couldn't let go of the idea of the lecture. I had come to see it as the last moment of my career, as a way to say goodbye to my work family. I also found myself fantasizing about giving a last lecture that would be an oratorical equivalent of retiring baseball slugger driving the final ball into the upper deck. I had always liked that final scene in The Natural when the aging, bleeding ball player Roy Hobbs miraculously hits the towering home run. Dr. Reese listened to Jay and to me. In Jay, she said,
She saw a strong, loving woman who had intended to spend decades building a full life with a husband, raising children to adulthood. Now our lives were being squeezed into a few months. In me, Dr. Reese saw a man not yet ready to fully retreat to his home life, and certainly not yet ready to climb onto his deathbed. This lecture will be the last time many people I care about will see me in the flesh, I told her flatly. I have a chance here to really think about what matters most to me, a chance to really think about what matters and to cement how people will remember me, and to do whatever I can on the way out. More than once, Dr. Reese had watched Jay and me sit together on her office couch, holding tightly to each other, both of us in tears. She told us she could see the respect between us, and she was often viscerally moved by our commitment to getting our final time together right. But she said it wasn't her role to weigh in on whether or not I gave the lecture. You'll have to decide that on your own, she said, and encouraged us to really listen to each other so we could make the right decision for both of us. Given Jay's reticence, I knew I had to look honestly at my motivations. Why was this talk important to me? Was it a way to remind me and everyone else that I was still very much alive? To prove I still had the fortitude to perform? Was it a limelight lover's urge to show off one last time? The answer was yes on all fronts. An injured lion wants to know if he can still roar, I told Jay. It's about dignity and self-esteem, which isn't quite the same as vanity. There was something else at work here, too. I had started to view the talk as a vehicle for me to ride into the future I would never see. I reminded Jay of our kids' ages, 5, 2, and 1. Look, I said, at 5, I suppose Dylan will grow up to have a few memories of me, but how much will he really remember? What do you and I even remember from when we were 5? Will Dylan remember how I played with him or what he and I laughed about? It may be hazy at best. And how about Logan and Chloe? They may have no memories at all, nothing, especially Chloe. And I can tell you this, when the kids are older, they're going to go through this phase where they absolutely, achingly need to know, who was my dad? What was he like? This lecture could help them answer that. I told Jay I'd make sure Carnegie Mellon would record the lecture. I'll get you a DVD. When the kids are older, you can show it to them, and it'll help them understand who I was and what I cared about. Jay heard me out and then asked the obvious question. If you have things you want to say to the kids or advice to give them, why not just put a video camera up on a tripod and tape it right here in our living room? Maybe she had me there. Or maybe not. Like that lion in the jungle, my natural habitat was still on a college campus in front of students. One thing I've learned, I told Jay, is that when parents tell children things, it doesn't hurt to get some external validation. If I can get an audience to laugh or clap at the right time, maybe that would add gravitas to what I'm telling the kids. Jay smiled at me, her dying showman, and finally she relented. She knew I'd been yearning to find a way to leave a legacy for the kids. Okay, perhaps this lecture could be an avenue for that. And so, with Jay's green light, I had a challenge before me. How could I turn this academic talk into something that would resonate with our kids a decade or more up the road? I knew for sure that I didn't want the lecture to focus on my cancer. My medical saga was what it was, and I'd already been over it and over it. I had little interest in giving it a discourse on, say, my insights into how I cope with the disease or how it gave me new perspectives. Many people might expect the talk to be about dying. It had to be about living. What makes me unique? That was the question I felt compelled to address. Maybe answering that would help me figure out what to say. I was sitting with Jay in the doctor's waiting room at Johns Hopkins, awaiting yet another pathology report, and I was bouncing my thoughts off her. Cancer doesn't make me unique, I said. There's no arguing that. More than 37,000 Americans a year are diagnosed with pancreatic cancer alone. I thought hard about how I define myself as a teacher, a computer scientist, a husband, a father, a son, a friend, a brother, a mentor to my students. Those were all roles I valued, but did any of those roles really set me apart? Though I've always had a healthy sense of self, I knew this lecture needed more than just bravado. I asked myself, what do I alone truly have to offer? And then, there in that waiting room, I suddenly knew exactly what it was. It came to me in a flash. Whatever my accomplishments, all the things I loved were rooted in the dreams and goals I had as a child, in the ways I had managed to fulfill almost all of them. My uniqueness, I realized, came from the specifics of all the dreams, from incredibly meaningful to decidedly quirky, that defined my 46 years of life. Sitting there, I knew that despite the cancer, I truly believed I was a lucky man because I had lived out these dreams, and I had lived out my dreams in great measure because of things I was taught by all sorts of extraordinary people along the way. If I was able to tell my story with the passion I felt, my lecture might help others find a path to fulfilling their own dreams. I had my laptop with me in that waiting room, and fueled by this epiphany, I quickly tapped out an email to the lecture organizers. I told them I finally had a title for them. My apologies for the delay, I wrote. Let's call it Really Achieving Your Childhood Dreams. Chapter 2, My Life in a Laptop. How exactly do you catalog your childhood dreams? How do you get other people to reconnect with theirs? As a scientist, these weren't the questions I typically struggled with. For 4 days, I sat at my computer in our new home in Virginia, scanning slides and photos as I built a PowerPoint presentation. I've always been a visual thinker, so I knew that the talk would have no text, no word script. But I amassed 300 images of my family, students, and colleagues, along with dozens of offbeat illustrations that could make a point about childhood dreams. I put a few words on certain slides, bits of advice, sayings. Once I was on stage, those were supposed to remind me of what to say. As I worked on my talk, I'd rise from my chair every 90 minutes or so and interact with the kids. Jay saw me trying to remain engaged in family life, but she still thought I was spending way too much time on the talk, especially since we'd just arrived in the new house. She naturally wanted me to deal with the boxes piled all over the house. At first, Jay didn't plan to attend the lecture. She felt she needed to stay in Virginia with the kids to deal with the dozens of things that had to get done in the wake of our move. I kept saying, I want you there. The truth was, I desperately needed her there, and so she eventually agreed to fly to Pittsburgh on the morning of the talk. I had to get to Pittsburgh a day early, however, so at 1:30 p.m. on September 17th, the day Jay turned 41, I kissed her and the kids goodbye. I drove to the airport. We had celebrated her birthday the day before with a small party at her brother's house. Still, my departure was an unpleasant reminder for Jay that she'd now be without me for this birthday and all birthdays to come. I landed in Pittsburgh and was met at the airport by my friend Steve Siebold, who had flown in from San Francisco. We had bonded years earlier when I did a sabbatical at the Electronic Arts, a video game maker where Steve was executive. We'd become as close as brothers. Steve and I embraced, hired a rental car, and drove off together, trading gallows humor. Steve said he'd just been to the dentist, and I bragged that I didn't need to go to the dentist anymore. We pulled into a local diner to eat, and I put my laptop on the table. I flashed quickly through my slides, now trimmed to 280. It's still way too long, Steve told me. Everyone will be dead by the time you're through with the presentation. The waitress, a pregnant woman in her 30s with dishwater blonde hair, came to our table just as the photo of my children was on the screen. "Cute kids," she said, and asked for their names. I told her, "That's Dylan, Logan, Chloe." The waitress said her daughter's name was Chloe, and we both smiled at the coincidence. Steve and I kept going through the PowerPoint, with Steve helping me focus. When the waitress returned with our meals, I congratulated her on her pregnancy. "You must be overjoyed," I said. "Not exactly," she responded. "It was an accident." As she walked away, I couldn't help but be struck by her frankness. Her casual remark was a reminder about the accidental elements that play into both our arrival into life and our departure into death. Here was a woman having a child by accident that she surely would come to love. As for me, though, the accident of cancer, I'd be leaving 3 children to grow up without my love. An hour later, alone in my room at the hotel, my kids remained in my head as I continued to cut and rearrange images for the talk. The wireless internet access in the room was spotty, which was exasperating because I was still combing the web looking for images. Making matters worse, I had started to feel the effects of the chemo treatment I'd received days before. I had cramps, nausea, and diarrhea. I worked until midnight, fell asleep, and then woke at 5 a.m. in a panic. A part of me doubted that my talk would work at all, and I thought to myself, this is exactly what you get when you try to tell your whole life story in an hour. I kept tinkering, rethinking, reorganizing. By 11 a.m., I felt I had a better narrative arc. Maybe it would work. I showered, I dressed. At noon, Jay arrived from the airport and joined me and Steve for lunch. It was a solemn conversation, with Steve vowing to help look after Jay and the kids. At 1:30 p.m., the computer lab on campus, where I spent much of my life, was dedicated in my honor, and I watched the unveiling of my name over the door. At 2:15 p.m., I was in my office, feeling awful again, completely exhausted, sick from the chemo, and wondering if I had to go on stage wearing an adult diaper I'd brought just as a precaution. Steve told me I should lie down on my office couch for a while, and I did, but I kept my laptop on my belly so I could continue to fiddle. I cut another 60 slides. At 3:30 p.m., a few people had already begun lining up for my talk. At 4 p.m., I roused myself off the couch and started gathering my props for a walk across campus to the lecturing hall. In less than an hour, I'd have to be on stage. Chapter 3: The Elephant in the Room. Jay was already in the hall, an unexpected full house of 400, and, as I hoped, on stage to check out the podium and get organized. She could see how nervous I was. While I busied myself arranging my props, Jay noticed that I was making eye contact with almost no one. She thought that I couldn't bring myself to look into the crowd, knowing I might see a friend or former student, and I'd be too overwhelmed by the emotion of that eye contact. There was a rustling in the audience as I got myself ready. For those who came to see just what a man dying of pancreatic cancer looked like, surely there were questions. Was that my real hair? Yes, I kept all my hair throughout chemotherapy. Would they be able to sense how close to death I was as I spoke? My answer: just watch. Even with the talk only minutes away, I continued puttering on the podium, deleting some slides, rearranging others. I was still working at it when I was given the signal. "We're ready to go," someone told me. I wasn't in a suit. I wore no tie. I wasn't going to get up there in some professorial tweed jacket with a leather elbow patch. Instead, I had chosen to give my lecture wearing the most appropriate childhood dream garb I could find in my closet. Granted, at first glance, I looked like the guy who took your order at the fast food drive-thru, but actually, the logo on my short-sleeve polo shirt was an emblem of honor because it is worn by the Walt Disney Imagineers, the artists, writers, and engineers who create theme park fantasies. In 1995, I spent a 6-month sabbatical as an Imagineer. It was a highlight of my life, the fulfillment of a childhood dream. And that's why I was also wearing the oval Randy name badge given to me when I worked at Disney. I was paying tribute to that life experience and to Walt Disney himself, who famously had said, "If you can dream it, you can do it." I thanked the audience for coming, cracked a few jokes, and then I said, "In case there's anybody who wandered in and doesn't know the backstory, my dad always taught me that when there's an elephant in the room, introduce it. If you look at my CT scans, there are approximately 10 tumors in my liver, and the doctors told me I have 3 to 6 months of good health left. That was a month ago, so you can do the math." I flashed a giant image of the CT scans of my liver onto the screen. The slide was headlined, "The Elephant in the Room." And I had helpfully inserted red arrows pointing to each of the individual tumors. I let the slide linger so the audience could follow the arrows and count them. "All right," I said. "That is what it is. We can't change it. We just have to decide how we will respond. We cannot change the cards we are dealt, just how we play the hand." In that moment, I was definitely feeling healthy and whole. The Randy of old, powered no doubt by adrenaline and the thrill of a full house. I knew I looked pretty healthy too, and that some people might have trouble reconciling that with the fact that I was near death. So I addressed it. "If I don't seem as depressed or morose as I should be, sorry to disappoint you," I said, and after people laughed, I added, "I assure you I am not in denial. It's not like I'm not aware of what's going on. My family, my 3 kids, my wife, we just decamped. We bought a lovely house in Virginia, and we're doing that because it's a better place for the family to be down the road." I showed a slide of the new suburban home we just purchased. Above the photo of the house was the heading, "I am not in denial." My point, Jay and I had decided to uproot our family, and I had asked her to leave a home that she loved and friends who cared about her. We had taken the kids away from their Pittsburgh playmates. We had packed up our lives, throwing ourselves into a tornado of our own making, when we could have just cocooned in Pittsburgh, waiting for me to die. And we made this move because we knew that once I was gone, Jay and the kids would need to live in a place where her extended family could help them and love them. I also wanted the audience to know that I looked good and I felt okay, in part because my body had started to recover from the debilitating chemotherapy and radiation my doctors had been giving me. I was now on an easier-to-endure palliative chemo. I'm in phenomenally good health right now, I said. I mean, the greatest thing of cognitive dissonance you will ever see is that I am really in good shape. In fact, I'm in better shape than most of you. I moved sideways towards center stage. Hours earlier, I wasn't sure if I'd have the strength to do what I was about to do, but now I felt emboldened and potent. I dropped to the floor and began doing push-ups. In the audience's laughter and surprised applause, it was almost as if I could hear everyone collectively exhaling their anxiety. It wasn't just some dying man, it was just me. I could begin. The first slide from my talk says, "Really achieving your childhood dreams." My childhood dreams. Being in zero gravity, playing in the NFL, authoring an article in the World Book Encyclopedia, being Captain Kirk, winning stuffed animals, and being a Disney Imagineer. Chapter 4, The Parent Lottery. I won the parent lottery. I was born with a winning ticket, a major reason I was able to live out my childhood dreams. My mother was a tough, old-school English teacher with nerves of titanium. She worked her students hard, enduring those parents who complained that she expected too much from kids. As her son, I knew a thing or two about her high expectations, and that became my good fortune. My dad was a World War II medic who served in the Battle of the Bulge. He founded a nonprofit group to help immigrant kids learn English. And for his livelihood, he ran a small business which sold auto insurance in inner city Baltimore. His clients were mostly poor people with bad credit histories or few resources, and he'd find a way to get them insured and on the road. For a million reasons, my dad was my hero. I grew up comfortably middle class in Columbia, Maryland. Money was never an issue in our house, mostly because my parents never saw a need to spend much. They were frugal to a fault. We rarely went out to dinner. We'd see a movie maybe once or twice a year. "Watch TV," my parents would say. "It's free." Or, better yet, go to the library, get a book. When I was 2 years old and my sister was 4, my mom took us to the circus. I wanted to go again when I was 9. "You don't need to go," my mom said. "You've already been to the circus." It sounds oppressive by today's standards, but actually it was a magical childhood. I really do see myself as a guy who had this incredible leg up in life because I had a mother and a father who did so many things right. We didn't buy much, but we thought about everything. That's because my dad had this infectious inquisitiveness about current events, history, our lives. In fact, growing up, I thought that there were 2 types of families: those who need a dictionary to get through dinner, and those who don't. We were in category number 1. Most every night we'd end up consulting the dictionary, which we kept on a shelf just 6 steps from the table. "If you have a question," my folks would say, "then find the answer." The instinct in our house was never to sit around like slobs and wonder. We knew a better way. Open the encyclopedia. Open the dictionary. Open your mind. My dad was also an incredible storyteller and always had said that stories should be told for a reason. He liked humorous anecdotes that turned into morality tales, and he was a master at that kind of story, and I soaked up his techniques. That's why when my sister Tammy watched my last lecture online, she saw my mouth moving. She heard a voice, but it wasn't mine. It was Dad's. She knew I was recycling more than a few of his choicest bits of wisdom. I won't deny that for a second. In fact, at times I felt like I was channeling my dad on stage. I quote my father to people almost every day. Part of that is because if you dispense your own wisdom, often others dismiss it. If you dispense and offer wisdom from a third party, it seems less arrogant and more acceptable. Of course, when you have someone like my dad in your back pocket, you can't help yourself, and you quote him every chance you get. My dad gave me advice on how to negotiate my way through life. He'd say things like, never make a decision until you have to. He'd also warn me that even if I was in a position of strength, whether at work or in a relationship, I had to play fair. Just because you're in the driver's seat, he'd say, doesn't mean you have to run people over. Lately, I find myself quoting my dad, even if it's something he didn't say. Whatever my point, it might as well have come from him. He seemed to know everything. My mother, meanwhile, knew plenty too. All my life, she saw it as part of her mission to keep my cockiness in check, and I am grateful for that now. Even these days, if someone asks her what I was like as a kid, she would describe me as alert, but not terribly precocious. We now live in an age when parents praise every child as a genius, and here's my mother figuring alert ought to suffice as a compliment. When I was studying for my PhD, I took something called the theory qualifier, which I can now definitively say was the second worst thing in my life after chemotherapy. When I complained to my mother about how hard and awful the test was, she leaned over, patted me on the arm, and said, "We know just how you feel, honey, and remember, when your father was your age, he was fighting the Germans." After I got my PhD, my mother took great relish in introducing me by saying, "This is my son. He's a doctor, but not the kind who helps people." My parents knew what it really took to help people. They were always finding big projects off the beaten path, then throwing themselves into them. Together, they underwrote a 50-student dormitory in rural Thailand, which was designed to help girls remain in school and avoid prostitution. My mother was always supremely charitable, and my father would have been happy giving everything away and living in sackcloth instead of the suburbs, where the rest of us wanted to live. In that sense, I consider my father the most Christian man I've ever met. He was also a huge champion of social equality. Unlike my mom, he didn't easily embrace organized religion. We were Presbyterians. He was more focused on the grandest ideals and saw equality as the greatest of goals. He had high hopes for society, and through his hopes, though they were often dashed, he remained a raging optimist. At age 83, my dad was diagnosed with leukemia. Knowing he didn't have long to live, he arranged to donate his body to medical science, and he gave money to continue his program in Thailand for another 6 years. Many people who saw my last lecture were taken with one particular photo that I flashed on this overhead screen. It's a photo in which I'm in my pajamas, leaning on my elbow, and it's so obvious that I was a kid who loved to dream big dreams. The wood slat that cuts my body is in front of the bunk bed. My dad, a pretty able woodworker, made me that bed. The smile on that kid's face and the wood slat and the look in the eyes, that photo reminds me that I had won the parent lottery. Although my children will have a loving mother who I know will guide them through life brilliantly, they will not have their father. I've accepted that, but it does hurt. I'd like to believe my dad would have approved of how I'm going about these last months of my life. He would have advised me to put everything in order for Jay, to spend as much time as possible with the kids, the things I'm doing. I know he would see the sense in moving the family to Virginia. I also think my dad would be reminding me that kids, more than anything else, need to know their parents love them. Their parents don't have to be alive for that to happen. Chapter 5, The Elevator in the Ranch House. My imagination was always pretty hard to contain, and halfway through high school I felt this urge to splash some of the thoughts swirling in my head onto the walls of my childhood bedroom. I asked my parents for permission. "I want to paint things on my walls," I said. "Like what?" they asked. "Things that matter to me," I said. "Things I think will be cool. You'll see." That explanation was enough for my father. That's what was so great about him. He encouraged creativity just by smiling at you. He loved to watch the spark of enthusiasm turn into fireworks, and he understood me and my need to express myself in unconventional ways. So he thought my wall painting adventure was a great idea. My mother wasn't so high on the whole escapade, but she relented pretty quickly when she saw how excited I was. She also knew Dad usually won out on these things, and she might as well surrender peacefully. For 2 days, with the help of my sister Tammy and my friend Jack Sheriff, I painted on the walls of my bedroom. My father sat in the living room reading the newspaper, patiently waiting for the unveiling. My mother hovered in the hallway, completely nervous. She kept sneaking up on us, trying to get a peek. But we remained barricaded in the room. Like they say in the movies, this was a closed set. What did we paint? Well, I wanted to have the quadratic formula on the wall. In a quadratic equation, the highest power of the unknown quantity is a square. Always the nerd, I thought that this was worth celebrating. Right by the door, I painted negative b plus over minus squared b2, 4 to the ac over 2a. Jack and I painted a large silver elevator door. To the left of the door, we drew up and down buttons, and above the elevator, we painted a panel with floor numbers 1 through 6. The number 3 was illuminated. We lived in a ranch house. It was just one level. So I was doing a bit of fantasizing to imagine 6 floors. But looking back, why didn't I paint 80 or 90 floors? If I was such a big shot dreamer, why did my elevator stop at 3? I don't know. Maybe it was a symbol of the balance in my life between aspiration and pragmatism. Given my limited artistic skills, I thought it best if I sketched things out in basic geometric shapes. So I painted a simple rocket ship with fins. I painted Snow White's mirror with a line. "Remember when I told you that you were the fairest?" I lied. On the ceiling, Jack and I wrote the words, "I'm trapped in the attic." We did the letters backwards, so it seemed as if we'd imprisoned someone up there who was scratching out an SOS. Because I love chess, Tammy painted chess pieces. She was the only one of us with any drawing talent. While she handled that, I painted a submarine lurking in a body of water behind the bunk bed. I drew a periscope rising above the bedspread in search of enemy ships. I always liked the story of Pandora's box, so Tammy and I painted our version of it. Pandora, from Greek mythology, was given a box with all the world's evil in it. She disobeyed orders not to open it, and when the lid came off, evil spread throughout the world. I had always drawn the story's optimistic ending. Left at the bottom of the box was hope. So, inside my Pandora box, I wrote the word hope. Jack saw that and couldn't resist writing the word Bob over hope. When friends visiting my room, it always took them a minute to figure out why the word Bob was there, and then came the inevitable eye roll. Given that it was the late 1970s, I wrote the words "disco sucks" over my door. My mother thought that was vulgar. One day, when I wasn't looking, she quietly painted over the word "sucks," and that was the only editing she ever did. Friends who'd come by were always impressed. "I can't believe your parents let you do this," they'd say. Though my mother wasn't thrilled at the time, she never painted over the room, even decades after I'd moved out. In fact, over time, my bedroom became a focal point of her house tour when anyone came to visit. My mom began to realize people thought this was definitely cool, and they thought she was cool for allowing me to do it. Anybody out there who is a parent, if your kids want to paint their bedrooms as a favor to me, let them do it. It'll be okay. Don't worry about the resale value of the house. I don't know how many more times I will get to visit my childhood home, but it is a gift every time I go there. I still sleep in that bunk bed that my father built. I look at those crazy walls. I think about my parents allowing me to paint, and I fall asleep feeling lucky and pleased. Chapter 6, Getting to 0G. It's important to have specific dreams. When I was in grade school, a lot of kids wanted to become astronauts. I was aware from an early age that NASA wouldn't want me. I had heard that astronauts couldn't have glasses. I was okay with that. I didn't really want the whole astronaut gig. I just wanted the floating. Turns out that NASA has a plane it uses to help astronauts acclimate to zero gravity. Everyone calls it the Vomit Comet, even though NASA refers to it as the Weightless Wonder, a public relations gesture amid the distracting attention from the obvious. Whatever the plane is called, it's a sensational place of machinery. It does parabolic arcs, and at the top of each arc, you get about 25 seconds when you experience the rough equivalent of weightlessness. As the plane dives, you feel like you're on a runaway roller coaster, but you're suspended, flying around. My dream became a possibility when I learned that NASA had a program in which college students could submit proposals for experiments on the plane. In 2001, our team of Carnegie Mellon students proposed a project using virtual reality. Being weightless is a sensation hard to fathom when you've been an earthling all your life. In zero gravity, the inner ear, which controls balance, isn't quite in sync with what your eyes are telling you, and nausea is often the result. Could virtual reality dry runs on the ground help? That was the question in our proposal, and it was a winner. We were invited to the Johnson Space Center in Houston to ride the plane. I was probably more excited than any of my students. Floating! But late in the process, I got bad news. NASA made it very clear that under no circumstances could faculty advisors fly with their students. I was heartbroken, but I was not deterred. I would find a way around this brick wall. I decided to carefully read all the literature about the program, looking for loopholes, and I found one. NASA, always eager for good publicity, would allow a journalist from the student's hometown to come along for the ride. I called an official at NASA and asked for his fax number. "What are you going to fax us?" he asked. I explained my resignation as a faculty advisor and my application as a journalist. "I'll be accompanying my students in my new role as a member of the media," I said. And he said, that's a little transparent, don't you think?" "Sure," I said, but I also promised him that I would be giving great information about our experiment onto the news websites and send film of our virtual reality efforts to more mainstream journalists. I knew I could pull that off, and it was a win-win for everyone. He gave me his fax number. As an aside, there's a lesson here. Have something to bring to the table because that will make you more welcome. My experience in 0G was spectacular, and no, I didn't throw up, thank you. I did get banged up a bit, though, because at the end of the magical 25 seconds, when gravity returns to the plane, it's actually as if you become twice your weight, and you can slam down pretty hard. And that's why we were repeatedly told, "Feet down." You don't want to crash land on your neck. but I did manage to get on that plane almost 4 decades after floating became one of my life goals. It just proves that if you can find an opening, you can probably find a way to float through it. Chapter 7. I never made it to the NFL. I love football, tackle football. I started playing when I was 9 years old, and football got me through. It helped make me who I am today. And even though I did not reach the National Football League, I sometimes think I got more from pursuing that dream and not accomplishing it than I did from many of the ones I did accomplish. My romance with football started when my dad dragged me kicking and screaming to join a league. I had no desire to be there. I was naturally wimpy and the smallest kid by far. Fear turned to awe when I met my coach, Jim Graham, a hulking 6'4" wall of a guy. He had a linebacker at Penn State and was seriously old school. I mean, really old school. Like he thought the forward pass was a trick play. On the first day of practice, we were all scared to death. Plus, he hadn't brought along any footballs. One kid finally spoke up for all of us. "Excuse me, Coach, there are no footballs." And Coach Graham responded, "We don't need any footballs." There was a silence while we thought about that. "How many men are on a football field at a time?" he asked us. 11 on a team, we answered. "So that makes 22. "And how many people are touching the football at any given time?" "One of them." "Right," he said. "So we're going to work on what those other 21 guys are doing. Fundamentals." That was this great gift Coach Graham gave us. Fundamentals, fundamentals, fundamentals. As a college professor, I have seen this one lesson so many kids ignore, always to their detriment. You've got to get the fundamentals down because otherwise the fancy stuff is not going to work. Coach Graham used to ride me hard. I remember one practice in particular. "You're doing it all wrong, Posh. Go back. Do it again." I tried to do what he wanted. It wasn't enough. "You owe me, Posh. You're going to do push-ups after practice." When I was finally dismissed, one of the assistant coaches came over to reassure me. "Coach Graham rode you pretty hard, didn't he?" he said. I could barely muster a yeah. "It's a good thing," the assistant told me. "When you're screwing up and nobody says anything to you anymore, that means they've given up on you." That lesson has stuck with me my whole life. When you see yourself doing something badly and nobody is bothering to tell you anymore, that's a bad place to be. You may not want to hear it, but your critics are often the ones telling you they still love you and care about you and want to make you better. There's a lot of talk these days about giving children self-esteem. It's not something you can give. It's something they have to build. Coach Graham worked in a no coddling zone. Self-esteem? He knew there was really only one way kids get to develop it. You give them something they can't do. They work hard until they can finally do it, and then you just keep repeating the process. When Coach Graham first got hold of me, I was this wimpy kid with no skills, no physical strength, and no conditioning. But he made me realize that if I work hard enough, there will be things I can do tomorrow that I can't do today. Even now, having just turned 47, I can give you a 3-point stance that any NFL lineman would be proud of. I realize that, these days, a guy like Coach Graham might get thrown off out of a youth sports league. He'd be too tough, and parents would complain. I remember one game where our team was playing terribly. At halftime, in our rush for water, we almost knocked over the water bucket. Coach Graham was livid. Geez, that's the most I've seen you boys move since the game started. We were 11 years old, just standing there, afraid he'd pick us up one by one and break us with his bare hands. Water, he barked. You boys want water? He lifted the bucket and dumped all the water on the ground. We watched him walk away and heard him mutter to an assistant coach, "You can give them water to the first string defense. They played okay." Now let me be clear. Coach Graham would never endanger any kid. One reason he works so hard on conditioning was he knew it reduces injuries. However, it was a chilly day. We'd all had access to water during the first half, and the dash to the water bucket was more about us being a bunch of brats than really needing hydration. Even so, if that kind of incident happened today, parents on the sidelines would be pulling out their cell phones to call the league commissioner, or maybe their lawyer. It saddens me to think many kids today are so coddled. I think back to how I felt during that halftime rant. Yes, I was thirsty, but more than that, I felt humiliated. We had let down Coach Graham, and he let us know in a way we never forgot. And he was right. We had shown more energy at that water bucket than we had the damn game, and he getting chewed out by him meant something to us. During the second half, we were back on the field, and we gave it our all. I haven't seen Coach Graham since I was a teen, but he just keeps showing up in my head, forcing me to work harder whenever I feel like quitting, forcing me to do better. He gave me a feedback loop for life. When we send our kids to play organized sports, football, soccer, swimming, whatever, for most of us, it's not because we're desperate for them to learn the intricacies of a sport. What we really want them to learn is far more important. Teamwork, perseverance, sportsmanship, the value of hard work, an ability to deal with adversity. This kind of indirect learning is what some of us like to call a head fake. There are two kinds of head fakes. The first is literal. On a football field, a player will move his head one way so you think he's going in that direction, and then he goes the opposite way. It's like a magician using misdirection. Coach Graham used to tell us to watch a player's waist. Where his belly button goes, that's where his body is going, he'd say. The second kind of head fake is the really important one. The one that teaches people things they don't realize they're learning until well into the process. If you're a head fake specialist, your hidden objective is to get them to learn something you want them to learn. The kind of head faking learning is absolutely vital, and Coach Graham was a master.